Hello, my name is Zachary Schulte, and this is an ethnographic survey of the personal phenomenologies and epistemologies of a market-segmented user base. Just kidding. This is the intimacy gradient in digital space, a lightning talk. Now, I have a bit of a caveat to say. This presentation was made over a year ago before I had my experience with quantitative data, and I just wanted to say it's a bit of a come with me and you'll be in a world of qualitative information presentation. But I still think it's important. Why? Because I want you to reconsider your product's entire existence for fun and profit. So let's think about the intimacy gradient. First, a little bit about me. I am a user researcher, but before I was a user researcher, I was in the master planning field as an assistant urban designer. And in master planning, we have a textbook called A Pattern Language. Perhaps if you're a software developer, you've heard of it. Pattern Language was written by Christopher Alexander, Murray Silverstein, and Sara Ishikawa. It is a collection of urban design patterns, which they describe as instructions for a friendly, healthy society. And these techniques, processes for envisioning, planning, and building physical spaces are provided to you at different scales, from a top-down view of regional, down to buildings, down to homes, down to the garden paths that you might take. It's a gradient of scales, if you will. Kind of a recursive gradient as well, because each scale itself contains its own patterns, which then formulate the entirety of the instructions of a pattern language. So if you want to think about these different scales, you should first imagine yourself as an astronaut on the moon, looking at the Earth with that Houston, we've landed feeling. And that view has you mesmerized. And you get up to go back to Earth with your really, really strong jetpack, and you're so chill that you boost yourself backward, far away from the moon, into the distant planets and stars, and you see all of the galaxies, travel millions of light years, and you see the gems of this universe amongst all the space rock, and a part of you cries, knowing that all you wanted to do was go towards the Earth and not further away from it. I'm sorry, a better metaphor would be skydiving. So consider like you're consider as though you're falling from a plane. You can look below you, see the regional boundaries, usually the large power lines, the general space between farmland, neighborhoods, urban centers. That is one chapter of a pattern language, and how it's organized is by regional boundaries. Then there are the chapters about neighborhoods and main streets. So as you're falling from the sky, you can perhaps see main arterial roads, street planters, different traffic signals, a neighborhood pool, a park, parking lots. There, you'll fall closer and closer and see buildings, the height, the space between a building and another building. You'll see homes situated next to each other. And then finally, you'll fall right into the backyard of a home with a beautiful garden and a garden path. And you'll walk along the garden path, look at the different views, and say hello to a bird bathing in the bird bath. So going back to the intimacy gradient, let's think about how a pattern language describes the intimacy gradient in real life. In our last example, you as a skydiver falling to a home, perhaps you go in through the front door of this house and you have made it to the entrance. Now, the entrance is a portion of the intimacy gradient, and this is where you can first familiarize yourself with the space. This is where you can take your hat off, take your shoes off, take your coat off. Then you walk into the public space, which is like a living room. And there, that's where you can be entertained. That's where the host will usually have all sorts of things available for you. Other spaces within the home, perhaps the kitchen or bathroom, would be considered more semi-private spaces. And then finally, a bedroom would be a completely private space. This is where an invitation comes into play. Now, an intimacy gradient and a scale like the region to neighborhood to building, as I described to you, they can be the same, and sometimes they don't have to be, and really that depends on the mind's perception of the familiarity of the space. So familiarity usually goes hand in hand with intimacy. So if you are experiencing that home for the 7th time, for the 100th time, for the 10,000th time, as though it's maybe a childhood home, that could be on a different scale. Or it could be on a type of gradient if you've been there so often that you can open up a drawer and maybe discover something that you've never seen before. Basically, your familiarity of a space changes how you experience that space. Let's consider the mind's perception of space for a second, and before we do that, let's consider how thoughts function. Now, let's talk a little bit about situated cognition, and I just want to say that this is a brief overview of a brief overview. This is from the Cambridge Handbook of Situated Cognition by Robbins and Aydede, which says that the mind, or the thoughts in your head, are situated. And when your mind is situated, when you have situated cognition, that means it's embodied, embedded, and extended. To have an embodied mind means that your physical flesh, your organs, your motor system, your visual perception, your hearing, all of that is included in your mind. So your mind is your brain and your body. To have embedded cognition means that the environment which surrounds you, the spaces, the rooms, the drawers, the tools. To have embedded cognition means that your mind is also your environment. And extended cognition means that you do not exist in a vacuum. You have a social mind. You have a mind that lies beyond you, to the people who you are closest to. So your mind is beyond just you. It's beyond the individual. One example I'd also like to take from another practice, another discipline for the mind's perception of digital space, and this also could be included in the mind's perception of space, the mind's perception of other people, is a concept called kinesthetic empathy. Now, kinesthetic empathy was proposed by John Martin, who was a modern dance critic in the 30s. Kinesthetic empathy basically means when what you see, you feel, and you reflect upon that feeling. Now, I'm saying you general, this doesn't apply to everybody, but kinesthetic empathy is essentially a mental haptic reaction from external information. John Martin gives the example of a ballet dancer performing, and as somebody watches that performance, they receive that haptic stimulus, they feel what they see the ballet dancer doing, and that ballet dancer is a figure which they connect to, and their mind feels as that figure does in that moment. And thinking about digital space, what else do we know? We know digital space is nonlinear, which means everything exists everywhere all at once. So as we just described the intimacy gradient, where a physical building is very linear, digital space means that there's a higher chance of just a completely smashed gradient, which leads to friction, confusion, an uncomfortable user. To kind of give an example of a smashed gradient, I'm going to look at a previous foray in the intimacy gradient in digital space. A company called Social Text around 2004 wrote about this. Social Text is a wiki service, and they talked about the intimacy gradient as far as their employee onboarding goes. Now, some of the tools, some of the embedded systems that kind of helped create their intimacy gradient, or what they found some issues in their intimacy gradient, were IRC greeting bots and their wiki collaboration space. Their greeting bots were solid. They were a perfect introduction to the company for outsiders they were a great example of a very nice entrance as far as the intimacy gradients goes. The wiki collaboration space was supposed to be ordered in a way in which there was a nice gradient. So you had a guest space which was available to all. You had a knowledge base available to employees and contractors, a product development wiki which was confidential, a core management wiki which was holding sensitive HR and financial information. And what they found was there was particular deep linking which occurs in this hyperlink, hypertext digital world and the internet that we live in. Some of that deep linking broke the gradient, caused maybe guest users to access places they weren't supposed to, and generally caused confusion for employees that were being onboarded. One of the members mentioned that it's like bypassing the porch area and hallway completely and then skipping straight into the bedroom. So this is just a lightning talk, and like I said, this is just to inspire you to completely reconsider your product. But let's think of other examples of intimacy in digital space. So Reddit, for example, has a very nice intimacy gradient. You have the front page, which you can access even if you're not a user. And you also have subreddits, which you can also access even if you're not a user. And that's kind of an example of semi-private spaces. They're still public, but they are there through invitation or otherwise for people to consume and find specific things that they want. And Reddit itself also has DMs. A lot of places have DMs, and DMs are a wonderful example of maybe an immediate private space within a digital product. When I created this presentation, I was thinking about the kinesthetic empathy concept and how the mind sometimes wants to have a figure to connect to, and I looked at an app called KKW, and that stands for Kim Kardashian West. And at the time, the app had just experienced an upgrade. So I was looking at the reviews in this app, and a lot of the users mentioned that there were a lot of places that this upgrade removed. These were places for them, places in their own perception of digital space. And it caused the users of KKW, of Kim Kardashian's app, to lose memories of things or events that they wanted to keep, made them a little bit sad, kind of broke their dreams, and made them lose that intimate connection they had to that figure that they connected with. Another example of your mind's perception of digital space and an intimacy gradient there is your Facebook profile. Obviously, you can have a public profile, and then you can make these private or friend list specific posts. And in a sense, your profile is a person. Your profile is also an HTML entity. But your profile is also a place. So your profile exists in multiple asynchronous locations. What that means is your profile is hosted on a server somewhere. It's a person hosted on a server somewhere that your friends can access, that you can access, but all of these places, maybe a friend's cell phone versus your desktop versus a future employer's iPad, they're all different, all nonlinear places. And in a way, your profile is in your friend's mind. It is a part of your friend's mind. It's that extended cognition. Your profile is a place maybe where your friend can experience you in some way. And it's interesting too, because a profile is also like people's memories of you. It doesn't always align with the you of the present moment. Yeah, it's just something to consider. So, like I said, this lightning talk is just kind of a quick way for you to be inspired and maybe think about your product from a different position. Your product is a space. Your product exists in your user's mind. So think about your product and the intimacy gradient. What are some strong aspects of your product in the intimacy gradient? What are weak aspects of your product in the intimacy gradient? What advantages does your product have right now that you can leverage as far as a smooth intimacy gradient experience goes? What dangers exist for your product at the moment? Finally, thinking about what you know from this general overview of a general overview of the intimacy gradient and digital space, what makes a great digital intimacy gradient experience? So I really appreciate you listening, and if you do want to reach out, maybe talk to me a little bit about this, or have any other ideas or references you want to share, you can always reach out to me, hello@zacharyschulte.com. Thank you so much.